Picture this. The year is 490 BC, and the most powerful empire the world has ever seen is marching toward a tiny collection of Greek city-states. The Persian Empire controls 3 continents, commands millions of subjects, and possesses wealth beyond imagination. Standing against this unstoppable force are just 10,000 Athenian citizen soldiers on a beach called Marathon. What happens next will determine whether democracy survives or dies, whether Western civilization is born or strangled in its cradle. This is the incredible true story of how one desperate battle changed the course of human history forever. Before we dive into this epic tale of courage against impossible odds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss the incredible stories we share about the moments that shaped our world. The Persian Empire of 490 BC was unlike anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. Stretching from the scorching deserts of Egypt to the snow-capped mountains of Central Asia, from the bustling cities of Mesopotamia to the fertile valleys of India, it was a colossus that seemed to swallow nations whole. At its heart sat Darius the Great, the king of kings, ruler of 46 different peoples, commander of armies that could blot out the sun with their arrows. Yet on the far western edge of his domain, on a rocky peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean Sea, something extraordinary was happening. The Greeks, divided into dozens of squabbling city-states, had developed something revolutionary, the idea that ordinary citizens could govern themselves. In Athens, this radical experiment called democracy was taking its first tentative steps, challenging the very notion that kings ruled by divine right. But empires don't tolerate defiance, especially not from insignificant city-states. And when Athens dared to challenge Persian authority, Darius decided it was time to remind the world why his empire was called eternal. He assembled a massive invasion force with one simple mission: sail across the Aegean Sea, burn Athens to the ground, and drag its people back to Persia in chains. What neither Darius nor his generals could have imagined was that on a crescent-shaped beach, 26 miles from Athens, they were about to face an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. These weren't professional soldiers fighting for pay or conquest. These were free men fighting for their homes, their families, and their right to choose their own destiny. To truly understand why the colossal Persian Empire would turn its vengeful gaze upon the tiny distant city of Athens, we must travel back a decade before Marathon, to the year 499 BC. Our journey takes us across the Aegean Sea to the sun-drenched coast of Ionia, in modern-day Turkey. Here, a string of wealthy and culturally brilliant Greek cities, Miletus, Ephesus, Halicarnassus, had flourished for centuries. They were the original heartland of Greek philosophy, science, and poetry. But these were not free cities. Since the conquests of Cyrus the Great, they had been absorbed into the Persian Empire. They were now subjects forced to pay heavy tribute to a distant foreign master, their own internal politics often manipulated by Persian-backed tyrants who enforced laws written in a language they couldn't read. These Ionian Greeks had grown increasingly restless under Persian dominion. They were a proud and independent-minded people, sailors and merchants who cherished freedom above all else. They listened to the epic poems of Homer, tales of their ancestors who had fought gods and toppled empires. They remembered the days when their ships had sailed freely across the wine-dark sea, when their cities had been ruled by their own laws and vibrant debates, not by the edicts of a satrap appointed by an unseen king thousands of miles away. This simmering resentment needed only a spark to ignite a wildfire of rebellion. That spark came not from a heroic freedom fighter, but from an ambitious and desperate politician, Aristagoras, the tyrant of Miletus, who had fallen out of favour with his Persian overlords after a failed military expedition and was looking for a way to save his own skin. In 499 BC, facing punishment and disgrace from the Persian court, Aristagoras made a fateful, self-serving decision. Rather than face his master's wrath alone, he would gamble everything on a grand revolt, recasting himself as a champion of Greek liberty. He sailed from city to city, using his powerful rhetoric to fan the flames of rebellion. He deposed the other Persian-backed tyrants, declared the restoration of democracy, and called for all of Ionia to rise up and throw off the shackles of empire. City after city answered his call, their citizens eagerly joining the rebellion, each one hoping to reclaim the precious independence their grandfathers had taken for granted. But the Ionians, for all their passion, faced a terrible and immediate reality. They were a scattered collection of coastal cities, outnumbered, outfinanced, and facing the most professional and disciplined military machine the world had ever seen. They desperately needed help. Desperate for powerful allies, the rebels sent ambassadors on a perilous journey across the Aegean to their fellow Greeks on the mainland. Their first and most important stop was Sparta. They pleaded with the Spartan king Cleomenes, showing him a map of the vast Persian Empire and promising him immense riches if he would join their cause. But the Spartans were a cautious, landlocked power, deeply suspicious of foreign entanglements. When Cleomenes learned that the journey to the Persian capital would take 3 months, he famously threw the ambassadors out, refusing to commit his legendary army to such a risky, far-flung venture. Most other city-states, terrified of attracting the wrath of the great king, also refused to help. But when the ambassadors arrived in Athens, they found a very different reception. Athens was flush with the radical, self-confident energy of its new democratic institutions. The citizens, proud of their own recent overthrow of tyranny, felt a kinship with their Ionian cousins. In a momentous and fiery debate in the public assembly, the people of Athens voted to intervene. They made a decision that would change history. They would send 20 of their finest warships to aid the rebellion. 20 triremes might not sound like much against the full might of the Persian navy, but to King Darius this act represented something far more dangerous than mere military assistance. It was an unprecedented direct challenge to his authority from an outside power. It was a declaration that some people, somewhere, refused to bow before the throne of the King of Kings. His fury turned to incandescent rage when, in 498 BC, these same Athenian forces joined the Ionian rebels in a daring raid inland. They marched on the Persian provincial capital of Sardis, a city of immense wealth and strategic importance, and burned it to the ground. The fire, which accidentally consumed the sacred temple of the local goddess Cybele, was seen by the Persians not just as an act of war, but as a profound and unforgivable act of sacrilege. When news of the sacrilege at Sardis reached Darius, his fury knew no bounds. The Ionian Revolt would ultimately fail. The full weight of the Persian Empire was a force no small collection of city-states could hope to resist. Persian gold bought betrayals among the Greek ranks, massive Persian armies crushed resistance on land, and a rebuilt Persian fleet, in a great naval battle at Lade, swept the rebel ships from the sea. By 494 BC, the last rebel stronghold of Miletus had fallen. The city was razed, its men killed, and its women and children sold into slavery, a brutal lesson to any others who might contemplate defiance. Ionia was once again firmly under the imperial boot. But Darius had a long memory, and an even longer reach. He had crushed the rebellion, but he had not forgotten the outside agitators who had helped start it. According to the historian Herodotus, the king was so obsessed with punishing Athens that he ordered one of his servants to stand before him at every meal, 3 times a day, and repeat the same chilling words: "Master, remember the Athenians." In the ancient world, diplomacy was often a prelude to war, a ritualized dance that came with a sharp blade hidden beneath silk robes. Before unleashing the full might of his military, King Darius, in keeping with Persian tradition, decided to first test the resolve of the Greeks. In 491 BC, he began what appeared to be a simple, empire-wide diplomatic mission. Persian heralds, men, whose office was considered sacred and inviolable, were dispatched by ship to every Greek city-state, from the smallest island polis to the great mainland powers of Athens and Sparta. They arrived not with threats or armies, but with a straightforward message from the King of Kings. The demand was elegantly simple, almost poetic, yet it was absolutely crushing in its implications. Each city, the heralds declared, must provide a tribute of earth and water to the great king. To modern ears, this might sound like a bizarre agricultural request, but every Greek, from the highest aristocrat to the humblest farmer, understood the profound and terrifying symbolism. Earth and water were the fundamental sacred elements of life itself, the very substance from which their cities, their farms, and their bodies were made. To give them to Darius was to offer a complete and total submission. It was an act of surrender that acknowledged that the great king of Persia owned not just their political allegiance, but their lands, their seas, and their very existence. Faced with this stark choice, submission or annihilation, city after city complied with the Persian demand. The island states of the Aegean, their shores completely exposed to the overwhelming power of the Persian navy, saw no other option and quickly submitted. The cities in the north of Greece, such as Macedon, already feeling the immense pressure of the Persian Empire on their borders, saw no choice but to bow to what they believed was the inevitable. Even some of the cities in southern Greece, calculating that the cost of resistance was total destruction, quietly gathered their symbolic tribute of soil and spring water, hoping to appease the approaching storm. The Persian campaign of intimidation was working flawlessly. The Greek world, it seemed, was beginning to crumble from within. But when the Persian heralds arrived in Athens, their ships docking at the bustling port of Piraeus, they encountered something they had never experienced before. Not fear, not quiet calculation, but outright democratic rejection backed by a righteous collective fury. The demand was presented to the ecclesia, the popular assembly, where every male citizen had a voice. They didn't just refuse the demand, they treated it as a profound insult to their freedom, their gods, and everything they held sacred. In a fit of democratic rage, according to the historian Herodotus, the assembled citizens voted to seize the Persian ambassadors and throw them into a deep pit known as the Barathron, a chasm used for executing criminals. They shouted down at the terrified heralds that if they wanted Athenian earth so badly, they could find plenty of it at the bottom. Not to be outdone by their Athenian rivals in either defiance or brutality, the Spartans demonstrated their own unique, laconic approach to diplomacy. When the Persian heralds delivered their ultimatum to the austere warrior city-state, the Spartan kings and elders listened to the demand for earth and water in silence. Then, according to legend, they seized the ambassadors and hurled them down a deep, dark well, grimly telling them to dig for their own earth and draw their own water from the depths. Both of these shocking acts, in Athens and in Sparta, were a catastrophic violation of one of the most ancient and sacred laws of the Greek world, the absolute immunity of diplomatic heralds. This was no longer a political disagreement. By murdering the king's sacred messengers, Athens and Sparta had committed an unforgivable religious and personal offence. War was now not just likely, it was absolutely inevitable. The die was cast. Darius could no longer treat Athens and Sparta as a minor irritation to be dealt with later. They had publicly and violently humiliated his representatives, defied his divine authority, and most dangerously had shown other potential rebels across the empire that the mighty Persian lion could be challenged and mocked. For a ruler whose immense power depended on the carefully cultivated perception of absolute, unquestionable dominance, such spectacular defiance could not and would not go unpunished. The storm was no longer gathering. It was about to break. With diplomacy violently rejected, King Darius unleashed the full, terrifying power of his empire. The Persian war machine that began assembling in 490 BC was a marvel of ancient logistics and military organization, a continental effort designed not merely to punish Athens, but to make an example of it so brutal that no Greek city would ever dare defy Persia again. The order went out across the royal road, and from every corner of the vast empire soldiers and sailors began converging on the western ports of Cilicia. The Immortals, the elite Persian heavy infantry whose ranks were always kept at exactly 10,000 men, marched from the imperial heartland of Susa and Persepolis. They were the empire's Praetorian Guard, disciplined professionals armed with spears, large wicker shields and powerful bows, their scale armour glittering, their mere presence on a battlefield a symbol of the great king's inescapable power. From the vast, open steppes north of the Black Sea, Scythian horse archers, the masters of mounted combat, rode in. These were warriors who lived their lives in the saddle, capable of firing deadly arrows with pinpoint accuracy at a full gallop, a terrifyingly mobile force that could harass and wear down heavy infantry long before the main battle was joined. From the great coastal cities of Phoenicia and Ionia, thousands of sailors and marines prepared their vessels for what was intended to be the greatest naval operation of the ancient era, a fleet so large it would seem like a floating city crossing the Aegean. The men chosen to lead this punitive expedition were not minor provincial governors sent to handle a local disturbance. They were members of the Persian High Command, a clear sign of how seriously Darius now took the Athenian threat. The overall command was given to Datis, an experienced and respected Median general renowned for his tactical brilliance and his loyalty to the throne. Accompanying him was Artaphernes, the son of the satrap of Sardis and Darius's own nephew. His presence was a powerful political statement. This was not just a military campaign, it was a personal matter for the royal family, an affair of honour that required a member of the imperial household to oversee the final, brutal punishment of Athens. Their mission was simple and unambiguous. Sail across the Aegean, subjugate the Cycladic islands, land in Athenian territory, burn Athens and its neighbour Eretria to the ground, and drag their surviving populations back to Persia in chains to be paraded as slaves before the great king. The Persian strategy was as elegant in its conception as it was terrifying in its implications. A direct assault on the port of Athens Piraeus was deemed too risky. It would force a naval battle in confined waters and an attack against the city's fortifications. Instead, Datis and Artaphernes chose a different approach. After island hopping across the Aegean and brutally sacking the city of Eretria, they would land their main force on the beach at Marathon, a wide crescent-shaped bay 26 miles northeast of Athens. The location offered several crucial advantages. It was far enough from the city to prevent an immediate panicked counterattack, giving the Persians time to disembark their massive force and establish a secure beachhead. The plain behind the beach was large, flat and firm, perfect terrain for their thousands of cavalry to operate, a key advantage they held over the Athenians' infantry-only army. It was also the former power base of the exiled Athenian tyrant Hippias, who was now an old man accompanying the Persian fleet, promising that his supporters within Attica would rise up and aid the invaders. From this secure base, the Persians could rest their troops and then launch the final, crushing assault on the city of Athens itself. The Persian fleet that arrived off the coast of Attica was said to have numbered 600 triremes, a naval force that dwarfed anything the Greeks could muster. Modern estimates suggest the land force they disembarked at Marathon numbered around 25,000 elite infantry and archers, including perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 of their feared cavalry. To the Greeks, accustomed to intercity battles involving a few thousand warriors at most, this seemed like an army vast enough to darken the sky with its arrows and shake the very earth with its tread. When lookouts on the mountains of Attica first spotted the sea black with Persian ships and sent word racing to Athens, a wave of sheer, unadulterated panic gripped the city. The storm had finally broken. The vengeance of the great king had arrived. The Athenian military response revealed both the inherent strengths and the terrifying weaknesses of their democratic system. Unlike the Persians, who could rely on the single, unified decisions of a supreme commander, the Athenians were led by a board of 10 generals, the strategoi. Each general was elected annually, and each represented one of the 10 tribal constituencies of Attica. In peacetime, this was a brilliant system of checks and balances. In the face of an existential military crisis, it was a recipe for indecision and chaos. Command of the army rotated among the 10 generals on a daily basis, a system that could prove utterly catastrophic in the midst of a multi-day battle. This democratic approach to high command, which valued political equality over military unity, would prove to be both a blessing and a nearly fatal curse in the coming battle. Among these 10 generals, however, one man stood out, a figure whose unique experience and iron will would prove decisive. His name was Miltiades. Unlike his colleagues, who were primarily Athenian politicians with some military experience, Miltiades was a seasoned professional warrior who understood the enemy intimately. As a former ruler of a semi-independent Greek state in the Thracian Chersonese, he had been a vassal of King Darius and had actually served with Persian forces during their earlier campaigns in the Black Sea region. He had seen the Persian army up close. He understood their tactics, had witnessed their strengths firsthand, their superb archers, their powerful cavalry, their unshakable discipline. But crucially, he had also identified their weaknesses, their lighter armour, their reliance on ranged combat over brutal close-quarters fighting, and their psychological dependence on the belief in their own invincibility. In the desperate hours ahead, as his fellow generals debated and dithered, Miltiades' unique, hard-won knowledge of the Persian way of war would prove to be Athens' single greatest asset. When the Persian fleet, a forest of masts and sails, finally beached on the wide bay of Marathon on what was likely September 12th, 490 BC, the Athenians found themselves facing their worst nightmare realized. After a frantic muster, they had managed to assemble their entire available fighting force. They could field perhaps 9,000 Athenian hoplites, citizen soldiers who fought as heavily armoured infantry. supplemented by another 1,000 brave hoplites from their small neighbouring city and loyal ally Plataea. These were not professional soldiers in the Persian sense. They were farmers, potters, merchants, and aristocrats, men who had temporarily left their lives behind to defend their homes. Each man had paid for his own equipment: the heavy bronze helmet, the sculpted breastplate, the greaves, and most importantly, the large concave wooden shield known as the aspis. Fighting shoulder to shoulder in a tight formation called the phalanx, they were a formidable defensive force, but against them stood a veteran Persian army with more than twice their numbers, a force that included thousands of the world's finest archers, professional cavalry, and a military high command with decades of experience conquering cities and nations that had seemed far more formidable than Athens. In their utter desperation facing the abyss, the Athenians made a decision that would become the stuff of legend. They needed help, and there was only one city in all of Greece whose military prowess might make a difference: Sparta. They chose their fastest citizen, a professional long-distance runner or hemerodromos named Pheidippides, and gave him what might have been the most important mission in the history of Western civilization. He was not just to carry a message, he was to run for the life of his city. His mission: run to Sparta, a punishing 140 miles of rugged mountainous terrain away, and beg the famous warriors to march to Athens' aid before it was too late. Pheidippides set off on his incredible, desperate journey. This was not a run on paved roads. This was a grueling ordeal across rocky paths, through thorny scrubland, and over steep mountain passes that would challenge even a modern, ultra-marathon runner equipped with proper shoes and nutrition. He ran day and night, pushing his body to the absolute limits of human endurance. The historian Herodotus adds a touch of the divine to the story, recounting that along a mountain path in Arcadia, Pheidippides was met by the god Pan, who asked why the Athenians paid him no honours. The runner, startled but focused, promised the Athenians would rectify this if they survived. In just 2 days, an almost superhuman feat of endurance, Pheidippides covered the distance that would normally take a week of hard travel. He arrived in Sparta, his body broken and exhausted, but his spirit determined, and delivered his desperate plea to the Spartan ephors. The Spartan response was both encouraging and utterly, soul-crushingly devastating. Yes, they would help their fellow Greeks against the barbarian invaders. Their legendary warriors were eager to test their mettle against the famed forces of the great king. An alliance with Athens was in their strategic interest, but they could not march immediately. The timing of the Persian invasion could not have been worse. The Spartans were in the middle of the Carneia, one of their most sacred religious festivals, dedicated to the god Apollo. Their ancient and inviolable laws absolutely forbade any military campaigns during this holy period, a taboo so strong that to break it would risk divine wrath and the ruin of their entire society. They gave their solemn word. They would march as soon as the full moon signalled the end of the festival, but that would be 6 more days. For Athens, 6 days might as well have been 6 years. The news from Sparta was a death sentence. By the time the Spartan reinforcements arrived, the battle would be long over. The peerless Persian cavalry would have already surrounded Athens, the city would be a smoking ruin, and its people would be in chains sailing east. The message was clear. The Athenians were completely, utterly alone. Meanwhile, back at Marathon, a tense and nerve-wracking standoff developed. The Athenian and Plataean army, under the command of their 10 generals, had marched from Athens and taken up a strong defensive position in the hills overlooking the plain. blocking the two main exits from the beachhead towards their city. For 5 agonizing days, the two armies faced each other across the plain, neither side willing to make the first move. The Persians, confident in their numerical superiority and their cavalry, were content to wait. They knew time was on their side. Every day the Athenians were pinned at Marathon was another day their city was left vulnerable. The Athenians, for their part, were trapped in an impossible dilemma. Desperately outnumbered, they knew that descending from the hills to attack the Persians on the open plain meant almost certain death. But to simply wait meant risking a Persian cavalry detachment bypassing them and racing to an undefended Athens, or watching their city's resolve crumble as the Persian threat loomed just a day's march away. The tension was unbearable, a strategic deadlock that could only be broken by a desperate gamble or a fatal mistake. The tension is building, isn't it? Before we get to the incredible climax of this story, take a moment to let me know in the comments, what would you have done in Miltiades' position? Would you have attacked against impossible odds, or tried to find another way? And don't forget to hit that like button if you're enjoying this journey back to one of history's most crucial moments. Inside the Athenian command tent, the debate among the 10 generals raged with the fury of a Mediterranean storm. The democratic system that was the pride of Athens in peacetime was now proving to be a near-fatal liability in a moment of supreme crisis. Callimachus, the Polemarch or war archon, held the nominal command of the force and the crucial tie-breaking vote, but he was a political appointee, not a seasoned strategist. He listened as his 9 colleagues, the elected strategoi, were paralyzed by indecision. Their opinions split dangerously down the middle. Some, seeing the futility of their position, urged an immediate retreat to the walls of Athens, arguing it was better to defend their homes and families directly than to die uselessly on this plain. Others, clinging to the desperate hope of Spartan aid, advocated for continued waiting, a strategy of inaction that grew more dangerous with every passing hour. But Miltiades, the man who understood the enemy better than any other Greek, saw something that the others, in their fear, had missed. For days he'd been watching the Persian camp with the keen eye of a predator. He noted their movements, their routines, and most importantly what was absent. The feared Persian cavalry, the arm of their military that the Athenians had no counter to on this open plain, was nowhere to be seen in significant numbers. His experience serving with the Persians told him that this wasn't just a temporary repositioning, it was a strategic opportunity, a fatal mistake made by the Persian high command. He correctly deduced that the Persian commanders, Datis and Artaphernes, famous for their patient and methodical approach to warfare, had likely grown impatient with the standoff. They had probably dispatched the bulk of their horsemen onto their transport ships to sail around the Attic peninsula and attack the undefended city of Athens directly, while their main infantry force held the Athenian army pinned at Marathon. Miltiades realized in a flash of strategic brilliance that this created a brief, fleeting window of vulnerability that might never come again. Without their cavalry, the Persian army lost much of its tactical flexibility and its greatest advantage on this terrain. The classic Persian strategy depended on using their thousands of mounted archers to harass, weaken and disorganize an enemy infantry formation from a distance, peppering them with arrows before their own heavy infantry advanced to deliver the killing blow. Stripped of their mobile missile platform, the Persian force was still a formidable army of professional archers and spearmen, but they were no longer invincible. They were, for a few precious hours, vulnerable to exactly the kind of direct, brutal, close-quarters assault at which the Greek hoplite excelled. With time running out and the debate still raging, Miltiades sought out Callimachus, the war archon. He presented his colleague with a stark, terrifying choice. They could continue waiting on this hill, a strategy that would almost certainly lead to a slow, certain defeat as they watched helplessly while the Persian cavalry ravaged their undefended city and their families. Or they could do the unthinkable. They could gamble everything, their army, their city, their lives, the very future of Athens, on one desperate all-or-nothing charge against the main Persian infantry right now while their cavalry was absent. It was the kind of decision that defines civilizations: choose a certain, slow, and cautious death, or risk everything for a single, fleeting chance at a glorious, impossible victory. The debate that followed revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of democratic decision-making in a crisis. Each of the opposing generals had valid concerns, legitimate fears and perfectly rational objections to Miltiades' seemingly suicidal plan. To charge across a mile of open ground against a numerically superior force of archers was to invite slaughter. But Miltiades' passionate and logical arguments, born from his unique understanding of the enemy, began to sway the tide. Ultimately, faced with the certain destruction of everything they held dear, the Athenian commanders chose courage over caution. When the final, decisive vote was taken among the 10 generals, the result was a deadlock, 5 for attacking, 5 against. It all came down to Callimachus. Miltiades made his final, impassioned plea, reminding the war archon that the fate of Athens' freedom rested entirely on his single vote. Callimachus, in an act of supreme civic courage, cast the deciding ballot in favour of Miltiades' plan. They would attack. They would attack at dawn, using a radical, unconventional tactical formation so unorthodox that it violated everything Greek military doctrine taught about how a proper battle should be fought. Miltiades' battle plan was a masterpiece of calculated risk, a brilliant improvisation born from his intimate knowledge of both Greek strengths and Persian weaknesses. Traditional Greek warfare for generations had emphasized the brute, irresistible strength of the hoplite phalanx. This formation relied on packing heavily armoured citizen soldiers, each carrying 70 pounds of bronze and wood, shoulder to shoulder into a dense, deep block. Their large, interlocking shields created an almost impenetrable wall of bronze, while their 8-foot-long spears, the doru, bristled outwards to impale any approaching enemy. The phalanx was a human battering ram, designed to win battles through a brutal head-on shoving match known as the othismos. But Miltiades, a true military innovator, understood that conventional tactics would lead to a conventional and catastrophic defeat against a numerically superior and wider enemy front. A standard Athenian phalanx would be easily outflanked and enveloped by the much longer Persian line. To win, he had to throw away the military manual and gamble on a set of tactics so unorthodox, so contrary to accepted wisdom, that they bordered on madness. His first and most radical decision was to deliberately and dangerously weaken the centre of his battle line. Instead of the traditional 8 to 12 ranks deep, he thinned out his central tribal units to just a few ranks of soldiers. To any other Greek general, this would have seemed like military suicide. The centre was traditionally the strongest point of any Greek battle line, the anchor upon which victory depended. A weak centre invited breakthrough and the complete shattering of the army. But Miltiades was setting a trap. He compensated for this weakness by massively reinforcing his flanks, packing his best troops, including the entire Plataean contingent on the left, into deep, powerful wings. His plan was no longer to win with a frontal assault, but to allow his centre to bend, to give way, and in doing so to draw the best Persian troops into a pocket where his powerful flanks could then turn inward and achieve a double envelopment. The plan's second element was even more revolutionary and physically demanding. Rather than advancing at the traditional slow walking pace of the phalanx, a pace designed to maintain the crucial cohesion of the shield wall, Miltiades ordered that his men would charge at full speed across the nearly 1 mile of open ground that separated the two armies. This violated every single principle of Greek heavy infantry warfare, which emphasized discipline, order, and the gradual, inexorable closing of distance with the enemy. To ask men laden with 70 pounds of armour to run a mile and then immediately engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat was to demand the seemingly impossible. But Miltiades, from his service with the Persians, had calculated the risks with the precision of a mathematician. He knew the greatest danger to his hoplites was not the Persian infantry but their thousands of archers. Persian archers were deadly, capable of firing volley after volley that could blot out the sun and turn an advancing army into a pincushion of arrows. However, their effectiveness was greatest at medium range, and they needed time to aim, fire, and reload. By ordering his men to run the entire distance, Miltiades was gambling that they could cross the killing zone, the roughly 200 yards where Persian arrows were most effective, so quickly that the archers would only have time for 1 or 2 ill-aimed volleys before the Athenians were upon them. It was a desperate race against a storm of arrows. The morning of the battle dawned clear and bright, with gentle winds blowing in from the Aegean Sea. As the 10,000 Athenian and Plataean hoplites formed up in their strange, unconventional battle line, thin in the centre, massively powerful on the wings, many of the citizen soldiers must have looked at each other with a mixture of fear and grim determination. They were about to participate in either the most brilliant victory in Greek history or a magnificent, glorious, and very public suicide. Everything depended on their speed, their courage, and the genius of the one man who had convinced them to gamble it all. When Miltiades gave the signal to advance, 10,000 Athenian and Plataean warriors raised their shields, levelled their spears, and began moving forward with their heavy bronze armour glinting in the bright morning sun. What started as a disciplined, unified advance quickly transformed into something the ancient world had never witnessed before. On a single unified command, the slow rhythmic march of the phalanx erupted into a full-speed charge. 10,000 hoplites, laden with 70 pounds of armour, began to run across nearly a mile of open ground, their war cry, "Elelelu! Elelelu!" a thunderous roar that echoed across the plain. The Persians, arrayed in their disciplined ranks, watched this development with a mixture of confusion and utter contempt. Their commanders, Dati and Artaphernes, had decades of experience fighting armies across 3 continents. In their world, infantry that broke formation and started running was an army that was disintegrating, either in a panicked, uncontrolled retreat or a suicidal, disorganized charge. They assumed the Athenians, terrified by the sheer size of the Persian host, had finally gone completely mad from fear. No rational military commander would ever order his heavy infantry to run such a massive distance and expect them to have any energy left to fight. The Persians calmly readied their bows, preparing to slaughter this rabble of madmen. But as the distance closed with shocking speed, and the sound of 20,000 bronze-shod feet pounding across the plain grew from a low rumble into a deafening, earth-shaking thunder, the Persian attitude shifted from contempt to concern, and finally to raw alarm. This wasn't a panicked mob fleeing the battlefield. This was a disciplined, coordinated military maneuver of terrifying speed and purpose, a human tidal wave of bronze and iron, unlike anything in their tactical handbooks. The Persian archers, expecting a slow-moving target, barely had time to get off one or two ragged, ineffective volleys before the Athenians were upon them, having crossed the deadly killing zone in a fraction of the expected time. The collision between the two armies created a sound that witnesses described as thunder from the gods, a horrific, grinding crash of bronze on wicker, of spear points on flesh and armour, as the careful calculations of generals suddenly gave way to the desperate, brutal reality of hand-to-hand combat. The sheer momentum of the Athenian charge carried them deep into the Persian lines, a shocking display of physical power. Initially, in the centre of the battlefield, everything proceeded exactly as Miltiades had planned and feared. The powerful elite core of the Persian army, their best infantry and archers, faced the deliberately weakened Athenian centre. The sheer weight and numbers of the Persian assault easily pushed the thin line of Athenian defenders back. The Greek centre buckled, bent, and began a fighting withdrawal in what appeared to be the beginning of a complete and total rout. Persian commanders, watching their troops advance successfully and break the enemy's main line, must have felt the familiar, satisfying thrill of another inevitable victory falling into place. But on the flanks, an entirely different and far more brutal story was unfolding. The heavily reinforced Athenian wings, deep with ranks of their best and strongest warriors, smashed into the lighter, less heavily armoured Persian formations with devastating, overwhelming effect. Here, the fundamental differences between the two warrior cultures became starkly apparent. The Persian soldier was a professional, fighting as part of a larger machine. The Greek hoplite was an individual citizen warrior, a product of a culture that prized physical perfection. Years of training in the gymnasium, the Greek emphasis on individual strength and physical conditioning, and the superior, all-encompassing protection offered by their heavy bronze armour began to tell. The Athenian wings did not bend. They shattered their opposition, routing the Persian flanks and beginning the slow, deliberate turn that would seal the fate of the Persian army. What happened next would be studied in military academies for the next 2.5 millennia. A maneuver so perfectly executed it would become the blueprint for countless battles to come. As the elite Persian centre, including the vaunted immortals, continued to push their successful advance forward, confident they were on the verge of breaking the Athenian army completely, Miltiades' brilliant, desperate trap began to close. The Persians, in their eagerness to exploit the weakness of the Greek centre, had overextended their lines, allowing themselves to be drawn deep into a pocket with the Aegean Sea at their backs. The successful and victorious Athenian flanks, having utterly routed their immediate opponents, now executed a complex maneuver that required both exceptional discipline and perfect timing, a feat nearly impossible for citizen soldiers in the heat of their first major battle. Instead of giving in to the intoxicating thrill of chasing their defeated enemies all the way back to the Persian ships, their commanders and sergeants screamed the orders to halt and reform. With a discipline that must have stunned the Persian observers, the two powerful Athenian wings turned inward, pivoting with near-perfect precision to attack the now exposed flanks of the victorious Persian centre from both sides simultaneously. Suddenly, the elite Persian infantry, the very heart of Darius's army, found themselves in an impossible, terrifying situation. What had been a successful, triumphant advance against a weak and yielding enemy centre had, in a matter of moments, become a horrific nightmare of encirclement. Bronze-clad Greek hoplites, their shields locked and their spears levelled, now pressed in from three directions, from the front, from the left, and from the right, turning what should have been a glorious victory march into a desperate claustrophobic struggle for mere survival. The hunters had become the hunted, caught in a closing vice of Greek bronze and iron. The psychological impact on the Persian forces was immediate and devastating. These were professional soldiers, veterans of campaigns across 3 continents, men who had never doubted their inherent superiority over any enemy they faced, but they were now in a situation for which their training had never prepared them. Trapped, with no room to properly use their bows, their primary weapon, they were forced into a brutal close-quarters melee against a heavier, better armoured enemy who seemed to be multiplying with every passing moment. The ordered ranks of the Persian centre began to disintegrate under the immense pressure. Panic, that most dangerous and contagious emotion on any ancient battlefield, began to spread like a plague through the Persian ranks. Individual soldiers, seeing their comrades falling all around them, hearing the triumphant war cries of the Greeks on all sides, and realizing that their path of retreat back to the beach was being cut off, started to break formation. What had been an organized, professional military advance rapidly deteriorated into a desperate, terrified mob, each man fighting for himself, trying to cut his way out of the closing trap and back to the perceived safety of the ships. The Athenians, their initial fear now replaced by the exhilarating certainty of victory, sensed the Persian collapse and pressed their advantage with the righteous fury of men defending their homes, their families, and their very way of life. The battle was no longer a contest of tactics. It was a slaughter. Every Persian who fell was one less invader who could threaten their city. Every step they pushed the enemy back was one step closer to saving their democracy, their freedom, and their future. The quiet beach of Marathon had become a crucible where the fate of a civilization was being forged in blood and bronze. The Persian retreat to their ships became one of the most complete and chaotic military disasters in ancient history. The organized units of the Persian centre, once the pride of the empire, dissolved completely into a terrified, stampeding mass of individuals. Each man, from the highest-ranking noble to the lowest conscript, was now concerned only with reaching the boats that represented their only hope of salvation. The Athenians, their blood up from the thrill of battle and their confidence soaring to godlike heights, pursued the fleeing enemy with a relentless, vengeful fury. They chased them across the marshy plain and onto the sands of the beach itself, giving no quarter. The final phase of the battle was no longer a tactical engagement. It was a brutal, one-sided hunt. At the water's edge, the final desperate act of the battle played out in a series of dramatic, heroic scenes that would inspire artists and poets for centuries. Athenian hoplites, still wearing their heavy bronze armour, did not stop at the shoreline. They charged directly into the Aegean surf, splashing into the waves to prevent the Persian ships from escaping. Some Greeks, in acts of almost superhuman strength and desperation, grabbed the ornate sterns of the triremes as they tried to launch, physically holding them in place while their comrades swarmed aboard to finish off the surviving enemy soldiers. It was here that some of the most famous acts of heroism occurred. Herodotus tells the story of Cynageros, the brother of the great playwright Aeschylus. He grabbed a hold of a Phoenician ship with his hand, and when a Persian sailor chopped it off with an axe, he allegedly grabbed it with his other hand, and when that too was severed, he clung on with his teeth until he was finally killed. When the brutal fighting finally ended and the last of the surviving Persian ships disappeared over the horizon, leaving 7 of their vessels captured and burning on the beach, the sheer, unbelievable scale of the Athenian victory became clear. The historian Herodotus, writing decades later, recorded casualty figures that seemed almost impossible. An estimated 6,400 Persian dead lay scattered across the plain of Marathon and the adjoining beach, their bodies a testament to the ferocity of the Greek hoplites. By stunning contrast, the Athenian losses numbered only 192 men. These fallen heroes were not buried in the city's cemetery, but were afforded the unique and ultimate honour of being buried together on the battlefield where they fell, a sacred burial mound known as the Soros, which can still be visited today. Among the Athenian dead was Callimachus, the war archon whose single, courageous vote had made the battle possible. He died as he had lived, a true democratic leader, fighting and dying at the front alongside the men he commanded, proving that a citizen official could possess the courage of any king. The great playwright Aeschylus, who would later write the definitive dramatic account of the Persian Wars in his play The Persians, fought bravely in the battle and, according to his epitaph, counted his participation as a marathonomikos, a marathon fighter, among his life's proudest achievements, even greater than his celebrated plays. But perhaps the most enduring legend of Marathon was yet to be born from this incredible victory. According to later Greek historians, with the Persian fleet sailing away, the Athenian generals realized that the Persian cavalry, which had been absent from the battle, might still be on its way to attack the undefended city of Athens. A runner, sometimes identified as the same Pheidippides who had run to Sparta, was dispatched from the battlefield to carry the news of the victory back to the anxious city. Racing over the 26 miles of rugged mountainous terrain that separated the battlefield from Athens, a journey he undertook after having already fought for hours in 70 pounds of armour, he arrived at the Athenian agora. He gasped out a single triumphant word, "Nenikakemen," we have won, and then, his heart giving out from the immense strain, he collapsed and died on the spot. While modern historians debate the historical accuracy of this specific account, conflating it with the earlier run to Sparta, the story itself captured something essential and true about the spirit that drove the Greek victory. These were a people willing to sacrifice everything to push their bodies and souls to the absolute limit and beyond, to preserve their freedom and their radical, unproven idea that they had the right to determine their own destiny. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Marathon sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world, tremors of disbelief and astonishment that are still being felt today. For the first time in living memory, the mighty Persian Empire, the global superpower, had suffered a major, humiliating military defeat in a pitched battle. The aura of absolute invincibility that had surrounded Persian arms for decades, the very foundation of their imperial authority, was shattered in a single morning's fighting on a remote Attic beach. The idea that a small force of citizen soldiers could not just resist, but utterly annihilate a professional Persian army was a world-changing revelation. News of the impossible victory spread across Greece like wildfire. Runners and far-sailing ships carried a message that seemed almost too good to be true. The Persians were not gods. Their armies were not invincible. The mighty war machine could be beaten. City-states that had been preparing to submit to Persian rule, that had already offered the symbolic earth and water, suddenly began to reconsider their options. The psychological impact of Marathon was far greater than its immediate military significance. It transformed the Greek mindset from one of fearful resignation to one of defiant hope, A crucial piece of this was the arrival of the Spartans. True to their word, the Spartan army, 2,000 strong, set out as soon as their religious festival ended. They marched the 140 miles to Athens in a remarkable 3 days. Arriving too late for the battle, they marched to Marathon anyway. There, they surveyed the thousands of slain Persians, the captured ships, and the victorious Athenians. They offered no criticism, only praise for the incredible achievement of their rivals, before turning around and marching home, having witnessed with their own eyes that the barbarian horde was not in fact unbeatable. In Athens itself, the victory was a cultural and political cataclysm that transformed the young democracy almost overnight. Citizens who had been uncertain and fearful about their radical experimental form of government now had irrefutable proof of its strength. They had seen that free men, fighting for their own cause, for their own families, and for their own political rights, could overcome the armies of any tyrant, no matter how powerful. The crushing victory at Marathon created a surge of civic pride and self-confidence that would fuel the golden age of Athenian culture. This newfound belief in their own exceptionalism would produce the generation of Pericles, the Parthenon, and the philosophical inquiries of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The triumph of democracy on the battlefield of Marathon became the moral and psychological foundation for its flourishing in the assembly and the agora. But Marathon was far from the end of the conflict between Greece and Persia. In many ways, it was only the beginning. Back in his palace, King Darius, humiliated by the defeat and infuriated by the death of so many of his soldiers and noblemen, was consumed by a desire for revenge. According to Herodotus, his anger towards Athens was now even greater than before. He immediately began planning an even larger, more overwhelming invasion, a personal crusade to crush Greece once and for all. While he would die before he could launch it, his son and successor, Xerxes, would inherit his father's thirst for vengeance. A decade later, Xerxes would lead an army and a navy of unprecedented size against Greece, setting the stage for the even more famous and legendary battles at Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. Yet, without the victory at Marathon, none of those later, larger victories would have been possible. Marathon was the crucial first act. It proved to the perpetually squabbling Greek city-states that they could stand together against foreign invasion and win. It validated their unique military system, the hoplite phalanx, proving that their heavy infantry could overcome the Persian combination of archers and cavalry. And most importantly, it instilled in the Greek psyche the core belief that their cause, the cause of freedom, was just, favoured by the gods, and worth any sacrifice. The ripple effects of Marathon, therefore, extended far beyond the ancient world. The preservation of Greek independence at this critical moment allowed for the continued, unfettered development of the philosophical and political ideas that would become the very bedrock of Western civilization. The concepts of democracy, of rational inquiry, of artistic achievement, and of individual liberty were all fragile, radical experiments in 490 BC. They were allowed to survive, to grow, and to flower in the soil that was watered with Persian blood on that fateful September morning, and from those roots much of the modern world would grow. Today, 25 centuries after that desperate sun-drenched charge across the plain of Marathon, the battle continues to inspire and resonate with people around the world. The modern marathon race, an event that tests the limits of human endurance in cities from Boston to Tokyo, covers the same 26-mile distance that the legendary messenger ran to announce victory. It serves as a living, breathing reminder of the human capacity for extreme sacrifice and perseverance in pursuit of a worthy goal. Every runner who crosses the finish line exhausted but triumphant is unknowingly paying homage to that first, desperate run for freedom. But the true legacy of marathon lies far deeper than athletic competition. In an age when democracy was a fragile, untested and localized experiment, when the concept of individual liberty was virtually unknown to most of humanity, and when the vast majority of people accepted as a fact of nature that they would live and die as nameless subjects of distant godlike kings, the Athenians proved something revolutionary. They proved that ordinary citizens, farmers, potters, poets and philosophers could govern themselves effectively, and more importantly could and would fight with a ferocity that professional armies of subjects could not match to defend that right. Marathon was the first great crucible of democracy, the moment when the idea was tested by fire and proved its strength. The 192 Athenians who gave their lives at Marathon were not treated as mere casualties of war. They were elevated to the status of national heroes, the saviours of their city. In a profound break with tradition, they were not returned to their family plots in Athens, but were buried together as a brotherhood on the battlefield in a great earthen mound, the Soros, that can still be visited today. Their names were inscribed on marble pillars, and their sacrifice was honoured with annual state ceremonies that continued for centuries. They had given their lives not for conquest, not for a king's glory, not for plunder, but for the radical, world-changing idea that a people should be free to choose their own leaders and shape their own collective destiny. The battle also demonstrated something profound and timeless about the relationship between freedom and military effectiveness. The Persian army, for all its immense size, its logistical sophistication, and its professional training, was ultimately a collection of subjects, conscripts, and mercenaries. They fought because they were ordered to, out of fear of their king or for the promise of pay. The Athenian army, by contrast, was composed of citizens fighting for a cause that was intensely personal. They were fighting for their own homes, which they could see in the distance. They were fighting for their own families, who would be enslaved if they failed. And they were fighting for their own future, for the political rights they themselves had voted to defend. They were not subjects, they were stakeholders. This fundamental distinction, the power of a motivated citizenry fighting for its own freedom, would echo through the corridors of history. It would be seen in the victories of the Roman Republic over the Hellenistic monarchies, in the triumphs of the American revolutionaries against the British Empire, and in the success of free nations against totalitarian regimes in the great conflicts of the 20th century. Marathon established the enduring principle that free people, when properly organized and sufficiently motivated, possess a spiritual and psychological advantage that no amount of numerical superiority or imperial might can easily overcome. It was the first, and perhaps greatest, victory for the idea of the West itself. As we stand here today, looking back across the vast expanse of more than 2.5 millennia of human history, the Battle of Marathon remains one of those rare, pivotal moments that truly changed everything. It was a hinge point of history. In a single, desperate morning, on a beach whose name would become forever synonymous with endurance and determination, 10,000 Greek citizen soldiers proved an eternal truth, that the course of history belongs not always to the most powerful, but often to the most determined and the most brave. They did not just win a battle. They won a future for an idea that was just beginning to take root in the world. The legacy of those 192 Athenian heroes who fell defending that idea continues to inspire and resonate with us today, often in ways we don't even realize. Every time we cast a vote in a free election, every time we openly debate and criticize our government without fear, every time we assume as a birthright that our individual liberties matter and are worth protecting, we are benefiting from the profound sacrifice made on that ancient battlefield. The very concept of the West, a civilization built on the foundations of individual rights, democratic governance, and rational inquiry, was arguably born in the bloody surf of Marathon. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, that seemingly invincible colossus of 490 BC, eventually crumbled under its own weight, its great kings and golden cities fading into the dust of history. Today, it is a subject for historians, remembered mainly for its immense scale and, ironically, for its spectacular defeats at the hands of the free Greeks. But the radical ideals that those Greeks died to defend, democracy, freedom, the rights of the individual, did not disappear. They became the foundation of the modern world, proving that some victories are so complete, so ideologically profound, that they reshape civilization itself for thousands of years to come. Marathon teaches us that overwhelming size and seemingly limitless power mean nothing when confronted by a people united and willing to fight for their principles. It reminds us that democracy isn't just a convenient form of government, but a precious, fragile, and powerful idea worth defending with our lives. And above all, it shows us that sometimes, in the darkest, most desperate moments of history, when all rational calculation points to certain defeat, ordinary people, driven by an extraordinary cause, can accomplish truly miraculous things. So the next time you face what seem like overwhelming odds, remember those Athenian warriors lining up at the edge of that plain. They were outnumbered, out-resourced, and facing a professional, world-conquering army that had never known a major defeat. But they possessed something more powerful than Persian numbers or professional training. They were fighting for their homes, their children, their freedom, and their future. And in doing so, they not only saved their city, they saved our world. If this story of courage against impossible odds has inspired you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales from history. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that ordinary people can change the world when they stand up for what's right. And let me know in the comments, what other battles from ancient history would you like to see covered? From Thermopylae to Hastings, from Cannae to Tours, history is full of moments when the fate of civilization hung in the balance. Thanks for joining me on this journey back to one of humanity's finest hours, and remember, the spirit of Marathon lives on in everyone who refuses to surrender their freedom without a fight.